Good morning, everybody. Thank you for all joining us today for what is the third webinar of the Brownfield development series, brought to you by Mills & Reeve and RSK. Just have to move to the next slide, John, please. Today, I'm going to be handing over to RSK's John Davies and Tom Henman. They're going to be discussing maximising the value of brownfield assets through natural capital thinking and rewilding. So we've got some housekeeping. Before we get started, I just need to cover some points. So the webinar will take 30 minutes and you'll be able to raise queries via the Q&A box in the link below. So you'll have that there. We'll pick up some of these at the end and I'll raise them with RSK and they'll obviously do their best to answer those. There'll also be a recording available afterwards so that you can re-watch or share with your colleagues. So you've got that as well. And now over to you, John and Tom.
Thanks very much, Callum. So just to introduce ourselves briefly, my name is Tom Henman. I'm a director with RSK Geosciences. I'm a land contamination specialist, but also have a strong interest in the beneficial reuse of marginal brownfield land. John Davies is a director of RSK Biocensus, which is our ecology specialism within the group. And he's also the brains behind our RSK wilding business, which he'll touch on as well. Next slide, please, John. So this is what we'll be covering. John's going to kick off with the first 4 items, telling us about biodiversity net gain, how this applies to brownfield land and the particular considerations that apply for those types of sites. And I'll also then thinking about wider benefits in terms of carbon offsetting, public green space and other natural capital benefits. I'm then going to come back and talk about really the flip side to that in terms of considering site constraints and interactions between, realising some of those opportunities and liabilities on sites. We've got a case study to show that how that perhaps has applied in practice. And then, as Callum mentioned, we've got time for questions and discussion. So I'll now hand it over to John. We've got a lot to get through. So tell us about biodiversity net gain.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so I'll kick off by just tell you what biodiversity net gain is about in case you were not aware. So this applies to development, or will apply to development. There's a definition there that I won't read out, but essentially it means that if you are developing land that has ecology on it, you need to demonstrate there is more biodiversity left after you've developed than when you started, which can seem quite a challenge if you've got a fair amount of kind of habitats on site, especially if you're building a housing development on an area of land. To end up with more biodiversity than you started with seems a bit difficult. Now, this will be mandated, we think, towards the end of this year when the Environment Bill becomes enacted. So biodiversity net gain will become mandatory in England, and you will need to demonstrate that there is 10% more biodiversity associated with your development than when you started. Now, I guess the good news, if you can see it that way, is that there seems to be potentially a targeted exemption for brownfield sites. This is still up in the air at the moment because it's going through the second reading in the Lords at the minute. But that will mean that if you have a brownfield site where you're really struggling to deliver a viable development and you don't have any really key habitats, you might be exempt from biodiversity net gain. Watch this space, I guess, is all we can say on that at the moment. But that looks like it's the government wanting to make sure that brownfield sites aren't held up necessarily. So this is how biodiversity net gain works in practice. You will need to get a good understanding, obviously, of your site. You'll need to map it in terms of its habitats. We use something called UKHab, the UK Habitats Classification System these days, which is a relatively new habitat mapping system that ties in very well with the DEFRA biodiversity metric. And this is a kind of a clever calculator that allows you to convert the mapping that you've done into a figure. And it does this by calculating, by multiplying the area of each of the different habitats you've got on site by its rarity, its distinctiveness, its condition. All of these things come together to give a score, which is we call biodiversity units. So you can use this. The good thing about it is that it's consistent across the country because everyone is using it now. There used to be quite a few different types of metric, but now there's just this DEFRA metric that most people are using. And it is a proxy for biodiversity because it doesn't look at species, it really is habitat based, but it does tell you how much biodiversity you've got on site before you do anything. Now, in order to understand whether you've got net gain or net loss, you obviously need to understand what would be there post-development. So you run, basically you map the habitats you are planning to create around the outside of your development, for example, or that you're retaining within the site, and you rerun the metric to see how much biodiversity there will be. Now, if you're creating quite a bit of nice species-rich habitat as part of your scheme, then you might end up with a gain. But you would need to end up with 10% more biodiversity units than you started. So if you had 50 biodiversity units at the start, you'd need 55 at the end in order to get your consent. So it can be quite challenging if you've got quite a biodiverse site. And I think most people seem to think that greenfield is good, brownfield is bad as far as wildlife is concerned, but that is way too simplistic. Brownfield sites can actually be really good for biodiversity. It's this sort of mosaic of habitats that you have, bare ground and short vegetation, a bit of scrub, bit of wetland. That combined with the low nutrient status of the substrate leads to high species richness. And the main reason for that is that when you've got nutrient in the soil, grasses tend to outcompete everything else. You just end up with grass. So when there's no nutrient or very little nutrient, then other species are allowed to flourish. And that is why these sites tend to be quite good. But I do want, you do need to recognize that can be an issue on brownfield sites. It's not always the case. But I also want you to understand that whilst this could be a constraint, it can be an opportunity, which hopefully I'll convince you of by the time we get to the end. So developing some brownfield sites could lead to loss of biodiversity. That's clear. But if you had big areas of just hard standing and just scrappy bits of buddleia, for example, or you've got pulverized fuel ash or whatever, there will be plenty of brownfield sites where biodiversity is very low. So it just varies very much from site to site, and you just need to get a feel as early as you can of how much of a constraint this might be for you. Now, if a brownfield site does end up being unsuitable for development for whatever reason, it could be access issues, it could be that remediation would be so expensive that it just won't be viable, then this kind of thin nutrient poor soil does mean you can create biodiversity, assuming it hasn't established on site yet. So it is an opportunity because you can then run the same metric and sell biodiversity units. So you can leave the site alone or manage it slightly and increase biodiversity and then sell those units. So that's why I say it is potentially an opportunity if you're not developing the site. So these sites aren't just left doing nothing, they can actually bring you some revenue. And you can sell those units to other developers, or you can use the biodiversity you're creating on one site to offset the impacts on another. And we call that biodiversity insetting rather than offsetting, because you're doing it on your own land, and that's more cost effective because you don't have to buy land to do it. So the biodiversity implications of remediation, obviously, if you're cleaning up a site, which often you will need to do with a brownfield site, depending on the amount of contamination, really it's for health and safety reasons, and you want to redevelop the site, or you're cleaning up the pollution so that you're not contaminating downstream. There are various reasons why obviously you'd want to remediate. And clearly on those sites where biodiversity is high and you need to do a lot of remediation, then achieving biodiversity net gain in those circumstances is going to be quite challenging because often it's quite high intervention when you're doing large scale remediation. Now, if you've got expensive remediation is required development and there is biodiversity on site, those two things can tip the balance away from from viable development, basically, because it's just too costly. You have to pay for the biodiversity offsetting and you have to pay for the remediation, unless, of course, this targeted exemption can save the day for you. So balancing these biodiversity net gain implications and the remediation costs on the cost side against the value of the land for development is obviously going to be key in decision making as we go forward. And really what I'm just saying is that these days, obviously you do that cost benefit analysis, but biodiversity does have to be part of those calculations now. Now, as I said, if you're not developing, do note that the kind of the traditional way of reinstating and capping sites with topsoil and sowing it with vigorous grasses, like in that bottom picture, that can be expensive, bringing in the topsoil, and you're missing a trick, because if you create, if you cap that with nutrient poor soil and you create biodiversity on it, then you've got a chance to make some income out of the site rather than just capping it and leaving it. So there is opportunity. So this is what a kind of a good, if you like, a good biodiverse restoration project might look like, and how you can get income from it. So you would be creating what you might call a biodiversity net gain, or a rewilding, that's very trendy at the minute, or natural capital vision for the site, to optimize not only the biodiversity, but all these other potential natural capital benefits that you can get. So this is actually an arable site. So it was a substation, an electricity substation with a lot of arable land around it, and we mapped how much biodiversity there was on site previously. Because it's arable, not very much, and then we created this design for the site in order to enhance the biodiversity, to see how that would run through the metric, and that led to an increase in biodiversity units on the land that equated to about £4 million. And you do have to sign up to this for 30 years, so it is a long-term commitment. But on the basis of £10,000 a unit, you know, it can bring a reasonable income. Though bear in mind that you still have to pay the capital costs of planting the trees and creating various other habitats, what have you. So in this example, you've got at the top, there were two little patches of ancient woodland that were floating in the middle of a field, basically. And so we've got tree planting here to link them all up. So that's really good for biodiversity, creating woodland, also good for carbon offsetting. So you can get income from that. The wetland creation here is alongside a stream and some fen habitat and a triple SI. So it's increasing the range of biodiversity. It's extending the nice habitat. It's also creating good habitat for biodiversity in its own right, obviously. It is cleaning up the water that's going into the stream. It is retaining the water, so slowing it down, so flood retention. And it's also good for carbon offsets as well, wetland habitat. And then this yellowy patch, which is basically where you just leave land like arable to just sort itself out, essentially. It's your kind of archetypal rewilding. If anyone's been to NEP or knows about NEP, it's that sort of scrubby grassland mosaic that is created, good for biodiversity, very low maintenance, low cost, so it's quite a good option. And then we also, a more kind of interventionist approach down the bottom here is to topsoil strip, sow that with a wildflower mix. You're creating lots of biodiversity in quite a small area, and you're also creating a nice amenity for the people nearby. So there are all sorts of different things that you can do with the site. Don't think that just because you can't develop a site for whatever reason that you just leave it and you don't get anything from it. There is real opportunity through natural capital and biodiversity and carbon to make an income. And this carbon that we keep talking about is, you know, everyone knows that we're heading towards net zero. That's everyone's intention. Tree planting is kind of the obvious way of doing that, but do bear in mind that all sorts of other habitats sequester carbon as well. And there's been a very useful paper that's come out recently to demonstrate that, how much each habitat sequesters. Then you've got the option for renewables, and do bear in mind that you can have biodiversity amongst the solar panels and wind turbines and battery storage and whatever, so they're not mutually exclusive. When you're creating habitat on a site, if it's hard standing currently, creating a lot of habitat holds back the water and cleans the water as well. So you've got the water quality improvement as well. So you've got an opportunity through this habitat creation to get all these other benefits. And there's societal benefits. So you could be creating a space near to habitation that is really nice for people to access, good for their well-being, all of these things, all these great things that you can, all these great benefits you can get, some of which you can get income for. Now, there are very clear routes to market, as we call it, for carbon offsetting, because that's a very mature market. Biodiversity net gain is starting to really take off. So there is a means whereby creating this habitat, you can get paid by developers elsewhere, or inset your own impacts, as I said before. So you can, you know, make this into a profitable solution. The other routes to market for things like water quality, there are funds available from water companies because you are cleaning up the water for them, so it's saving them money, so you can apply to those funds. You can also get funds for flood protection. So there are means whereby we can access funding to carry out this work, and you get paid to do it, basically. And that's really what we do in my company, RSK Wilding, is to get the most bang for your buck out of habitat creation, all of this different natural capital, optimizing the different natural capital benefits that we can get for people. So the question ultimately is develop or not develop. you know, at the moment, government policy has been for a long time is promoting brownfield over greenfield, but that doesn't always make sense, especially if you've got brownfield sites that are biodiverse, and so we need to be aware of that, noting that exemption, of course. So delivering biodiversity net gain can be difficult when you've got a lot of biodiversity on site. So we're just basically saying you need to understand the constraints and the opportunities in order to properly determine what you're going to do with this land. And if you can't build houses or use it for employment use for whatever reason, then this natural capital approach can be a good alternative. So you don't need to think, oh, damn, we can't develop the site, let's just leave it. Don't just leave it. There are plenty of things that we can do to do good stuff for the environment whilst at the same time getting an income. Right, I shall pass over to Tom now.
Thanks, John. So we obviously taken you through a lot of the opportunities there, and in particular ways of generating revenue through biodiversity net gain and some of these other natural capital benefits. But we're now going to look at the flip side to that in terms of site constraints and environmental liabilities, because it's just as important to be able to understand, you know, how those affect those options and ultimately, you know, affect the revenue generation that could be obtained. So thinking about a few aspects here. So potential or known environmental liabilities or ongoing costs that aren't aligned to revenue streams. So thinking here that for sites like quarries where there are, you know, outstanding restoration requirements under planning, or landfill sites where there could be licenses or permits in place that need surrender ultimately, and there may be ongoing requirements for monitoring to support that process, and how can that be undertaken alongside realising aspects such as biodiversity net gain. Where there are requirements for remediation of land contamination risks, obviously to think very carefully about the interfaces between those and habitat generation or some of the other aspects. Thinking about interactions between, you know, ex situ remediation, where we're undertaking, you know, bulk excavations, clearly can have a much greater impact on habitats and soil than in situ type approaches. For sites that have very large amounts of hard standing reinforced concrete, then, you know, if that's to be removed, then that's a significant cost and constraint. And how can we design a scheme around that to sort of minimise that element? And obviously, where we're looking at renewables, we're looking at loadings on the site for, you know, wind turbines, solar, and so on. Then, you know, geotechnical and mining considerations that come into that. And of course, there may be future regulatory uncertainties post Brexit that we need to think about as well. So a number of considerations here about, you know, alongside realising these opportunities, you know, are there also opportunities to undertake low cost long-term remediation in order to reduce those liabilities over time? Can we undertake site monitoring alongside that to assess long-term changes in site condition and support licence or permit surrender where that's applicable? And can biodiversity net gain be achieved within plans that are required for site restoration or remediation under other regulatory regimes? And what are all the interactions between these things? Next slide, please, John. So we've developed a combined approach to look at all of these aspects, to look at the opportunities and benefits alongside these constraints and interactions. And we're really looking at a sort of multi-criteria analysis approach that we're working with a number of landowners with very large portfolios to apply this. Really thinking about you know, potential impacts in terms of, you know, what exists currently that could be damaged by planned remediation or restoration. What are the potential interactions? You know, for example, planting on sites in some cases can mobilise contamination, but in other cases you can achieve immobilisation. You can achieve stabilisation of contaminants, and clearly you want to design the scheme to encourage the latter and not the former. Also thinking about impacts on soil carbon, which isn't really very well understood in terms of brownfield sites. And clearly we want to be maintaining or where possible increasing the organic carbon we've got through these types of projects. And it's very much a phased approach that we developed to minimise costs at the earlier stages, identify the sites which have the most potential for revenue generation, you know, working within those identified site constraints and obviously minimising liabilities. Next slide, please, John. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but basically our approach is around these three main strands where we look at land contamination remediation constraints and the liabilities that, that may be present on sites and how they could be affected by the proposed revenue generating opportunities. We've got the biodiversity natural capital strand, obviously John has been talking about, which ultimately feeds into initial strategies for rewilding, biodiversity net gain, and other natural capital benefits. And then we may well have a renewables strand on the right there, looking at some potential renewables feasibility and energy storage on sites, and how that then again interacts with all these elements to end up with a combined site appraisal and opportunities assessment. So I'll hand back to John to talk through a case study where we put some of these ideas into practice.
So this is, thanks Tom, this is a colliery site in near Chesterfield that we looked at a few years ago. So this is pre-biodiversity net gain, of course, but it illustrates the issues quite well. So this site was quite a diverse site. So you can see on the top drawing, that's a kind of a habitat map showing the variety of different habitats that were present. And the idea was that the local authority wanted to remediate the site, return the lagoons to public amenity use, so cleaning up the water. So there was quite a lot of restoration and remediation that needed to be done on this site. And it was quite a biodiverse site to start with. As I said, biodiversity net gain wasn't a prime driver at the time. Ecology certainly was part of it, as you'll be aware. Protected species, etc. But I think it's worth saying that post the Environment Act, biodiversity net gain will be an issue. So this was a project where things worked out okay, but it'll be much better going forward that you plan these things. So what happened was that you can see the bottom drawing, that the area was capped with quite a low nutrient status soil, as it turned out, and it was just left as amenity. Now the positives were we had a positive protected species outcomes. We cleaned up the contaminants, the pollution was dealt with. You had a nice big open space for public access. And interestingly, and by luck rather than design, you ended up with a large flower-rich neutral grassland. Now we didn't have to use the developmetric in those days, but what happened was that the soil that was used was quite low nutrient status, and we had some species-rich grassland around the outside of the site. So that kind of rained a wildflower seed mix onto the site, and it turned into somewhere really, really nice. So although we'd lost the kind of habitat diversity and heterogeneity you had in that top map, including woodland and scrub and wetland, you actually ended up, when we applied the metric, with a net gain. And the reason for that is that this species-rich grassland does score pretty well in the developmetric. And so we ended up, by luck, really, by chance, with a net gain. But what would be much better going forward, obviously, is that you understand those issues up front. You know that you will have to understand the biodiversity on site and what you're going to create, so that you can plan it and you can plan the costs and the benefits. That's what the metric looks like. So this is the summary slide on the metric. So the baseline habitats, it came to about 63.5 units, and the habitat units afterwards on that kind of lower map that looks less diverse because it's all orange, because that habitat is actually really good, you ended up with more than 10% increase. So I think if we were remediating somewhere like this today, we definitely would want to use the metric from the outset, so you understand what the issues are right from the start. There are no surprises. And we'd use that to carry out this cost benefit analysis. As I said earlier, biodiversity now needs to be part of that analysis, not just how much it's going to cost to remediate, whether the other access issues, and overall whether it's going to be viable for development. The biodiversity needs to be part of that consideration. But also, if development isn't appropriate for whatever reason, then you can use biodiversity net gain to plan that as an opportunity. So you could do biodiversity or carbon offsetting on the site, maybe without the need to remediate, depending on how contaminated the site is. That will save a lot of cost and create value. Also, you could put solar panels, turbines, and battery storage on the site amongst the biodiversity. They're not mutually exclusive, as I said. It might be that you're creating space for public recreation or return it to agriculture. There are various different options, but you need to go through that process of working out how to get the maximum benefit from this land. So it's really important to understand how biodiversity net gain which will happen, is going to fit into this so that you can maximize the opportunities for natural capital and renewables and whatever else there is. And every site is very different. So, you know, getting to understand where you lie right from the start, I think would be very important and very valuable. Right, we've hurtled through. We've got about 4 minutes for questions, I think, if I can hand back to Callum.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Tom. Really interesting presentation there. So let's see some questions that have been raised. Starting with the first one we've got. What should we be doing as developers to plan for this, and when do you expect this to kick in?
Well, the Environment Act will probably come in, we think, towards the end of this year, but I think the actual requirement will be another 2 years coming. That said, I think you should definitely be planning for it, because local authorities are adopting this as policy anyway, and a lot of companies are adopting 10% biodiversity net gain as policy already. So whether it's mandated or not, I think it'll be difficult to get consent on projects without demonstrating net gain. So at the very least, I think you should be preparing for it by understanding how the process works and looking at your sites and working out, you know, what the opportunities and what the constraints are. Because I think in order to get consent for housing or employment use, this will be an issue that you need to be aware of, definitely.
And relating to that, I mean, one of the things that could well be helpful that we're looking at with other developers is, you know, looking at existing schemes, perhaps schemes that have, you know, received planning approval, you know, fairly recently, and looking at that from the point of view of, you know, what's the likely biodiversity net gain or loss that might be achieved, and also perhaps looking back at some schemes that have been developed out fairly recently. Again, you know, what is the net gain or loss? To really give an insight of, you know, what's the kind of current state of play on projects, and how might that be affected by biodiversity net gain requirements coming in.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Tom. I think we've got another question come up here. If you buy BNG credits for your development, does it have to be in the same locality?
Good question. Yes, generally it will need to be in the same local authority area, because otherwise local authorities will be consenting schemes that might lead to biodiversity loss in their area, and then you're creating biodiversity outside their area, and they'll get a bit grumpy about that because they will end up with losing biodiversity. So that is generally how it's going to pan out. A local authority will pretty much insist it's in the same county, at least the same kind of their local area. And in fact, the metric works in such a way that if you are doing offsetting quite a way away, then that penalizes you and you don't get so many credits for that.
Great. Okay, thanks, John. I think just we've got time, just one more question here. So will there be a minimum site size before this needs to be considered?
Another good question. I don't think so. I mean, I think if you're looking at a site that's only half a hectare, it's going to be quite tricky to do this. But at the moment, I don't think there is a size maximum or minimum on this. That isn't written into the legislation as far as I can tell. So I think you will need to do it on most sites. But obviously, the smaller the site and the more kind of hard standing there is, the easier it will be. I've dealt with developers with very small sites. You just need to find like half a biodiversity unit or something. So it's not very expensive. So the smaller the site, the kind of easier it is to demonstrate net gain.
Great. Thank you, John. I think any other questions, we said at the start of this, if you want to, you can contact obviously us at Mills and Reeve or RSK direct. We've got details coming up. Next.
Oops.
Sorry, there we go.
Sorry.
So yeah, next upcoming webinar will be on the 14th of September. It's going to be led by my colleague and boss, Keith Davison, and that'll be on the environmental liability transfer. I've just got the next slide. Is feedback. So you can give us feedback, please, for our presentation today. There should be a form or a link to that, which you can give that back through. I think just next one. And yep, thanks very much all for joining us. And I think a big thank you to John and Tom for presenting on what is found to be a big big area that's going to have a huge impact on the development field. So thank you very much.